welcome. Tonight we step into the candlelit shadows of the late 18th century, where the men we now call icons were haunted by the terrifying possibility that their great experiment would end in total ruin. In this journey, we strip away the marble statues to uncover the hidden anxieties and fire bells in the night that nearly broke the men who built a nation. Did you know the founding fathers, those stoic figures of history, secretly battled crippling anxieties and sleepless nights? Imagine George Washington tossing and turning, or Thomas Jefferson scribbling frantic notes in the dead of night, desperately searching for peace. Tonight, we are unearthing their forgotten fears and the surprisingly human lengths they went to for a good night's sleep. Prepare to see icons like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams in a completely new light as we expose the private anxieties that kept them awake. In the popular imagination, George Washington exists as a monument of unyielding stone, the stoic, silent general standing in the prow of a boat amidst the jagged ice of the Delaware. But the peril of the portrait is that it masks the agonizing pulse of a man who spent 8 years in a state of perpetual internal crisis. To understand the forgotten fears of the founding fathers, one must look past the oil paintings and into the ink-stained pages of Washington's private correspondence. Here, the whispers of war were not just about the roar of British cannons, but about the silent, creeping dread of a collapse from within. Washington's true fear was not that he would lose a battle, but that the very idea of America would dissolve into a cycle of bankruptcy and desertion before it could ever take its first breath. As you settle into the quiet of the night, imagine the cold, damp air of a winter encampment at Morristown or Valley Forge. The sound of the camp is not the trumpet of victory, but the hollow coughing of men whose boots have rotted away and whose stomachs have been empty for days. Washington sat in his tent, lit by a single flickering candle, writing letters to a continental Congress that often seemed more interested in petty regional squabbles than in the survival of the army. His forgotten fear was the fear of the great dissolution. He saw the morale of his troops as a fragile thread being pulled thinner and thinner by the failures of the colonial governments to provide pay, food, or blankets. Every morning, he looked at the desertion reports with a heart-deep anxiety, wondering if this would be the day the thread finally snapped. Washington's letters reveal a man haunted by the peril of the purse. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that a revolution cannot be fueled by idealism alone. It requires a supply of hard currency and bread. His nightmares were of an army that would simply walk away not out of malice, but out of the sheer, mechanical necessity of survival. He wrote of the specter of anarchy, a fear that if the army dissolved, the vacuum would be filled by a chaotic, fractured collection of colonies, each ripe for the picking by a European power. To Washington, the whispers of war were the quiet conversations among his officers about the futility of their sacrifice. He carried the burden of being the only person holding the entire experiment together through the sheer force of his will, a weight that he felt in every fiber of his aging frame. Beyond the immediate concerns of the battlefield, Washington harbored a deep-seated dread of disunion, even before the Constitution was a glimmer in the delegates' eyes. He saw the rise of regional jealousies. He feared that the different states were like 13 separate clocks, none of which kept the same time. His private diaries reflect a man who worried that the nascent government was a house built on sand. He saw the seeds of division being planted in the very soil of the struggle for independence. The fear was that the American people, once freed from the tyranny of a king, would find the responsibility of self-governance too heavy to bear. He worried that they would trade their newfound liberty for the quietude of a new master out of a desperate desire for stability. The constant threat of international intervention was another silent companion to his nights. Washington was acutely aware that America was a small pawn in a much larger global game between Britain, France, and Spain. His fear was that the United States would become a satellite, a puppet whose strings were pulled in London or Versailles. He navigated the dance of diplomacy with a profound skepticism, fearing that a help from a foreign power would eventually turn into a possession by that same power. This was a sophisticated, intellectual peril that kept him awake long after the camp had fallen silent. He envisioned a future where America was perpetually embroiled in the entangling alliances of the old world, a cycle of conflict that would bleed the young nation dry before it could ever grow. As you listen to the ticking of your own clock, think of the immense, crushing weight of leadership that Washington bore. It was not a glory. It was a daily confrontation with the possibility of total failure. He was a man who valued character above all else, yet he lived in a world where he was constantly forced to compromise, to beg, and to threaten just to keep his men from starving. The stoic portrait was his shield, the mask he wore to keep the whispers of war from infecting the hearts of those around him. In private, the mask slipped, revealing a man who was deeply afraid that the revolution would end in a whimper of financial ruin and social collapse. Tonight, let the image of Washington's flickering candle be a symbol of the resilience that can exist alongside fear. The forgotten fears were real, and they were heavy, yet the work continued. The scratching of his pen on the paper was his way of fighting the darkness, one letter at a time. The world outside his tent was cold and uncertain, but within there was a steady determination to see the night through. Imagine the silence of the camp now. The fires are banked, the sentries are at their posts, and the whispers of war have faded into the quiet sighing of the wind. The world you live in is the answer to his fears. The government did not collapse. The Union did not dissolve. The army did not walk away. The stability of the nation is the legacy of a man who was brave enough to be afraid. Feel the comfort of that stability now. You are not responsible for the survival of a republic. You are only responsible for your own rest. Let the weight of Washington's dilemmas fade into the mists of history, leaving you with nothing but the steady, unhurried peace of the present. The great dissolution did not happen. The night is secure, the country is whole, and you are safe. While Washington's fears were forged in the freezing mud of the battlefield, Thomas Jefferson's anxieties were born in the hallowed silence of his library at Monticello. To look into the private mind of Jefferson is to discover a man who viewed the world as a delicate balance of ideals, a balance he feared was constantly on the verge of being tipped into chaos. For all his soaring rhetoric about the unalienable rights of man, Jefferson's secret diaries and private letters reveal an underlying dread that the Republic's soul was being corrupted even as it was being born. His fears were not of musket fire, but of the seeds of division that he saw being sown in the very heart of the new American government. As you settle deeper into your rest, imagine the atmosphere of Monticello at dusk, the chirping of the cicadas in the Virginia woods, and the soft, steady ticking of the great clock in the entrance hall create a deceptive sense of tranquility. Jefferson sat in his sanctum, surrounded by thousands of books. But his mind was often miles away in the cauldron of factionalism that was Philadelphia or New York. His forgotten fear was that the fragile experiment in self-governance would be hijacked by a new kind of aristocracy, a rise of monocrats and speculators who would trade the liberty of the farmer for the power of the bank. To Jefferson, the heartbeat of the Republic was the independent yeoman farmer, and he feared that this pastoral ideal was being suffocated by the urban, industrial vision of his rivals. Jefferson's hidden worries often focused on the creep of corruption. He viewed the emergence of political parties, the factions he so despised, as a poison in the body politic. He feared that men would eventually owe their loyalty to a party rather than to the truth or the nation. In his private writings, he expressed a profound anxiety that foreign influence would find a backdoor through these divisions. He watched the cycles of the French Revolution with a mixture of hope and horror, fearing that the old world and its history of tyranny would inevitably bleed back into American soil. His fear was that the American people would become pawns of European intrigue, their democratic energy diverted into the service of foreign kings and ministers. Perhaps the most haunted aspect of Jefferson's internal world was the silent battle he fought over the future of slavery. While he penned the words, "All men are created equal," he lived a daily life that was entirely dependent on the labor of enslaved people. His private diaries reveal a man who understood the moral peril of this contradiction with a piercing clarity. He famously wrote that he trembled for his country when he reflected that God is just. This was not a passing thought, but a deep-seated fear that the seeds of division inherent in slavery would eventually lead to a great convulsion, a civil war that would tear the Union asunder. He saw the wolf by the ears, as he called it, a realization that the nation could neither safely hold on to slavery nor safely let it go. This was the unspoken shadow over every page he wrote, a fear that the Republic's soul was permanently fractured. Jefferson also harbored an anxiety about the fragility of the written word. He worried that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were merely parchment barriers that could be swept away by a charismatic leader or a panicked majority. His fears were of the silent erosion of liberty, the step-by-step surrender of rights in exchange for security or order. He envisioned a future where the government would grow into a bloated entity, distant from the people it was meant to serve. This was a sophisticated intellectual dread, the fear that the experiment would fail not because of a sudden collapse, but because of a slow decay of the Republican spirit. He believed that for a republic to survive, it required a perpetual revolution of the mind, and he feared that the people were too easily lulled into a state of lethargy. As you listen to the steady rhythm of your own breathing, think of the contrast between the public philosopher and the private, anxious man. Jefferson was a master of the long view, yet his private thoughts were often trapped in the narrow passage of immediate political feuds. He felt the crushing weight of being a founding architect, a responsibility to ensure that the foundation was perfectly level. Every factional disagreement felt to him like a crack in the granite. His fear of Alexander Hamilton's financial systems was not just a policy disagreement. It was an existential dread that the soul of America was being traded for a system of paper and debt. Tonight, let the image of Jefferson's quiet library be a place of refuge for your own thoughts. The seeds of division, he feared, were indeed planted, and they would grow into the great conflicts of the future. Yet the Republic did not vanish. The parchment barriers held, the Republican spirit proved more resilient than he dared to hope, and the cycle of American life continued to evolve. The silent battles of his mind are now the quiet chapters of history books. They no longer have the power to disturb the peace of the Virginia night. The world outside is dark and still. The cicadas have fallen silent. The great clock at Monticello has been wound for the night, and the seeds of division are dormant beneath the soil of the past. You are free from the burden of the Republic's soul. Let the image of Jefferson finally putting down his pen and blowing out his lamp be your guide. The library is dark, the books are closed, and the fragile experiment has survived another day. You are safe in the steady, unhurried rhythm of the present, where the only thing that matters is the deep, peaceful stillness of your own rest. If Alexander Hamilton's peers were the steady pulse or the philosophical ideals of the new nation, Hamilton himself was its frantic nervous system. Drawing from a turbulent past, Hamilton lived in a state of constant, rhythmic motion, fueled by the dread that a government without a solid financial backbone would simply wither and die. For Hamilton, every ledger and every line of the tax code was a defensive wall built against the return of the chaos witnessed during the war. As you settle into the quiet of this section, imagine the scratching of Hamilton's quill in a cramped office in New York. The city outside is a chaotic, post-war jumble, but inside, Hamilton is attempting to impose a mathematical order on a vacuum. His forgotten fear was the peril of the void. He had seen the continental currency become not worth a continental. A collapse of trust that he feared was the natural state of republics. His nightmares were filled with scenes of public credit evaporating, leaving the nation unable to defend itself, unable to build, and unable to command respect. To Hamilton, a nation without a reliable financial system was not a nation at all. It was a polity of beggars. Hamilton's anxiety was compounded by his unseen struggles with political enemies. He felt himself to be a man of pure energy, surrounded by men of theory. His diaries reflect a frustration with those who feared a central bank or a national debt. He saw his vision for a unified industrial America being dismantled by what he called the spirit of locality. He feared that the states were centrifugal forces, constantly trying to fly away from the center. The sound of his world was the ticking clock of a deadline, the interest payments due to France, the salaries of the soldiers, the mounting costs of a government that had no way to collect revenue. He lived in a state of financial vertigo, always looking down into the abyss of national bankruptcy. The personal toll on Hamilton was immense. He was a man who had risen from nothing through the application of his own intellect, and he feared that the fragility of his own reputation was tied to the fragility of the nation. He was haunted by the ghost of disunity, the idea that the United States would fracture into 3 or 4 smaller, warring confederacies. In his private letters, he spoke of the poison of faction with an intensity that matched Jefferson's, though his solution was the opposite. He feared that, without a strong, energetic government, the cycles of human nature would inevitably lead to a reign of the mob. His dreams were of the guillotine of anarchy crossing the Atlantic, a terror that kept him at his desk until the birds began to chirp in the Manhattan dawn. Hamilton also harbored a dread of the Great Stagnation. He feared that if America remained a purely agricultural society, it would never truly be free. He envisioned an industrial pulse for the nation, factories, canals, and a navy that could protect American commerce on the high seas. His fear was that the Jeffersonian dream was actually a path to obsolescence. He worried that the American people were too comfortable in their fields, unaware that the great powers of Europe were industrial predators waiting for an opening. This was a fear of weakness, an anxiety that haunted his every proposal for a tax, a tariff, or a mint. As you listen to the steady, unhurried rhythm of the night, think of the frantic energy Hamilton poured into the foundation. He was building a machine out of paper and promises, and he was the only one who truly understood how the gears were supposed to mesh. Every unseen struggle was an attempt to tighten a bolt or oil a hinge in the great engine of state. His haunted dreams were the price he paid for his foresight. He saw the potential for a financial empire, but he also saw the 1,000 ways it could fail before the first coin was struck. Consider the image of Hamilton finally leaning back in his chair, the ink drying on his report on manufactures as a source of calm. The anarchy he feared did not consume the land. The debt he managed became the credit that built the world's largest economy. The disunity was managed, and the centrifugal forces were held in check by the very systems he agonized over. The frantic pulse of his office has faded into the quiet halls of the Treasury. The city of New York is now sleeping, its energy stilled for the night. The papers are filed, the ledgers are balanced, and the haunted dreams are part of a past that paved the way for your secure present. You do not need to build a nation from scratch. You only need to accept the peace of the night. Let the ghost of Hamilton's anxiety fade into the soft, gray light of history. The machine is running, the foundation is solid, and you are safe. Consider the image of Hamilton finally leaning back in his chair, the ink drying on his report on manufactures as a source of calm. The anarchy he feared did not consume the land. The debt he managed became the credit that built the world's largest economy. The disunity was managed, and the centrifugal forces were held in check by the very systems he agonized over. The frantic pulse of his office has faded into the quiet halls of the Treasury. As the elder statesman of the Revolution, Benjamin Franklin occupied a space that was distinct from the frantic energy of Hamilton or the intellectual fire of Jefferson. Having lived through the rise and fall of empires and the slow, steady progression of scientific discovery, Franklin's forgotten fears were seasoned with the weary patience of age. While the younger men worried about the mechanics of the law or the structure of the bank, Franklin's secret diaries and correspondence reflect a deeply felt anxiety about the character of the citizenry. His fear was the peril of the fading virtue, the quiet dread that the American people might lack the moral stamina required to maintain the freedom they had so violently won. Imagine the atmosphere of Franklin's home in Philadelphia during the final years of his life. The ticking of a grandfather clock and the steady, occasional crackle of a hearth fire provided the backdrop for his reflections. Franklin was a man who believed in the improvement of the self, yet he looked at the growing factions and the rising greed of the post-war era with skepticism. He famously remarked that the Constitutional Convention had produced a republic if you can keep it. This was not just a witty retort, it was a distillation of his greatest fear. He worried that the virtue of the common man, interest, was a finite resource that was already beginning to evaporate. Franklin's hidden worries often focused on the peril of the mob. While he was a champion of the people, he had seen the violence of crowds in London and Paris, and he feared that the American spirit could easily tilt from liberty to license. In his private papers, he expressed a concern that the new nation would become too comfortable. He feared that prosperity would bring a lethargy, leading the people to neglect their civic duties. He envisioned a future where the citizens would become prey to the demagogue, a cycle where a charismatic leader would trade on the people's ignorance and vanity to dismantle the very institutions Franklin had helped build. This was the peril of the lazy mind, an anxiety that haunted his reflections on the education of the youth. The personal toll of Franklin's fear was a sense of quiet urgency. Even as his body failed him, he remained obsessed with the creation of libraries, schools, and civic organizations. He saw these not as luxuries, but as fortifications against the decay of virtue. His diaries reflect a man who felt he was in a race against time, not just his own time, but the time of the Republic. He feared that the seeds of vanity were being planted in the young nation's heart, leading to an obsession with titles, wealth, and European-style status. He, who had spent his life in the pursuit of useful knowledge, feared that the American people would trade their curiosity for consumerism, their work ethic for the hollow pursuit of luxury. Franklin also harbored a dread of institutional rigidity. He had a scientific mind that understood the peril of the fixed state. He worried that the Constitution, if treated as a sacred, unchanging relic, would eventually become a shackle rather than a living framework. He feared that future generations would lack the flexibility to adapt the laws to new discoveries and new challenges. His private notes suggest a man who viewed the government as a great experiment in physics, something that required constant adjustment and observation. The fear was that the people would become dogmatic, losing the ability to compromise and reason that had been the hallmark of the Enlightenment. Think of the contrast between the jovial Dr. Franklin of the public eye and the sober observer of the private page. He used humor as a tool to mask his deeper anxieties about human nature. He knew that men were inconsistent, capable of great sacrifice one day and petty selfishness the next. His fear was that the American system required a higher average of goodness than humanity was usually able to provide. This was a sophisticated social peril, the fear that the machinery of freedom was too delicate for the coarseness of the men who would operate it. The image of Franklin in his study, surrounded by his inventions and his papers, serves as a bridge to a calmer understanding. The fading virtue he feared did not result in the total collapse of the society. The institutions he fostered, the libraries, the universities, the civic associations became the bedrock of American stability. The lazy mind was countered by an enduring passion for innovation and learning. The shackles of the past were all broken and reforged by each generation. The city of Philadelphia is quiet now, the bustle of the markets stilled by the night. The republic that Franklin feared for has endured through cycles of crisis and renewal. You are not responsible for the virtue of a nation. You are only a participant in its ongoing story. Let the image of Franklin finally leaning back in his chair, a half smile on his face as he watches the last embers of the fire, be your guide. The experiment is continuing, the lessons are learned, and the virtue of the people survives in the quiet, steady rhythm of daily life. You are safe in the peace of the present, where the only requirement is the deep stillness of your own rest. Now imagine John Adams sitting in the dim light of his study in Quincy, Massachusetts, his hand moving at a feverish pace across the pages of his diary. Of all the founding fathers, Adams was perhaps the most attuned to the peril of the future's judgment. His secret fears were not merely about the survival of the state, but about the vanity of history, the gnawing anxiety that the true struggles, the real sacrifices, and the plain, unvarnished facts of the revolution would be buried under a layer of theatrical myth. Adams harbored a deep-seated dread that he would be cast as a secondary character in a story written by his enemies, or, even worse, by pedantic historians who never felt the cold or the fear of the actual moment. As you settle into the quiet weight of your blankets, imagine the atmosphere of Peacefield, Adams' home. The sound of the world outside is the distant crashing of the Atlantic surf, a reminder of the vast, indifferent expanse of time. Adams sat at his desk, his mind a whirlwind of forgotten grievances. His private letters to Abigail reflect a man who felt the peril of public criticism with a raw, physical intensity. He feared that the American Revolution would be remembered as a series of effortless triumphs led by perfect men, rather than the messy and often terrifying series of accidents and desperate gambles that it actually was. To Adams, the truth was a difficult thing to maintain, and he feared that vanity would eventually win the day. Adams' hidden worries often centered on the peril of the misunderstood motive. He lived in a state of defensive alertness, fearing that his honest bluntness would be remembered as monarchical ambition. His diaries reveal a man who felt he was being edged out of the heart of the narrative by more charismatic figures like Jefferson or Franklin. He famously wrote that the history of our revolution will be one continued lie from one end to the other, an expression of his fear that the theatrical and the sensational would replace the truth of committee meetings, late-night drafts. He feared that future generations would look back at the founders as gods, thereby making their example impossible for ordinary, flawed men to follow. The personal toll of this fear was a life of self-imposed isolation. Adams felt the crushing weight of his own reputation, fearing that any mistake would be magnified by the partisan press into a betrayal of the cause. His private notes suggest a man who felt unloved by the very people he had served, an anxiety that he would be forgotten once his usefulness had passed. He looked at the rise of Napoleon in Europe and feared that America, too, would eventually succumb to the vanity of a great man trading the steady rule of law for the shining, hollow glory of a dictator. This was the peril of the ego, a dread that the human desire for a hero would eventually dismantle the democratic structures he had sacrificed his health and peace to build. Beyond his place in history, Adams harbored an anxiety about the fickleness of the people. He feared that democracy was a high-wire act that would eventually collapse under the weight of its own passions. In his private papers, he expressed a concern that the citizens would become envious of their leaders, leading to a cycle of ostracism where the most capable men were driven from public service by the noise of the mob. He envisioned a future where the government was a contest of vanities rather than a search for the common good. This was a sophisticated psychological peril, the fear that the American spirit was too proud, too restless, and too vain to accept the quiet limitations of a constitutional republic. The contrast between the prickly, stubborn president of history books and the vulnerable, reflective man of the private page is stark. Adams used his crustiness as a shield against a world that he felt did not understand him. He knew that truth was a lonely path, and he feared that he would be left behind on that path, while others marched toward a golden, false memory. His fear was that the vanity of the age would prioritize popularity over principle, a concern that haunted his reflections on the future of American leadership. The image of Adams finally setting down his pen, the scratching of the quill ceasing as he looks out toward the dark Atlantic, brings a sense of grounded perspective. The vanity of history he feared did not erase his contribution. The honest truth of his labor, his mastery of the law, his diplomatic persistence, and his dedication to duty remains the bedrock of American tradition. The perfect men of myth have been balanced by the scholarly rediscovery of his own humanity. The fickleness of the people has been tempered by an enduring respect for the rule of law that he championed. The house at Peacefield is quiet now, the surf of the Atlantic, a soothing, distant hum. The contest of vanities has faded into the archives of the past, leaving behind a legacy of integrity and grit. You are not responsible for how the future will judge the present. You are only a passenger in the unfolding story of time. The image of Adams finally closing his diary and blowing out his candle serves as a guide. The records are kept, the truth is safe, and the vanity of the world is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried rhythm of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep, peaceful stillness of the now. Think of James Madison, a man of slight stature but immense intellect, hunched over his desk in the humid air of Montpelier. While others fought with swords or soaring oratory, Madison fought with the logic of history and the structural mechanics of human nature. His forgotten fear was the most sophisticated of all, the peril of the tyranny of the majority. Madison's secret diaries and private notes reveal a man who viewed a pure democracy not as a sanctuary, but as a self-destructing engine. He harbored a deep-seated dread that a passionate majority, swept up in a moment of economic or social fervor, would use the machinery of the state to trample the rights of the few, ultimately leading the republic back into the arms of a dictator. As you settle into the steady comfort of your own breathing, imagine the atmosphere of Madison's study. The sound is the persistent scratching of a pen, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of a heavy parchment map or a volume of ancient history. Madison was a political architect, and he feared that the house he was building, the Constitution, would be crushed by the weight of numbers. His hidden worries focused on the peril of the faction. He believed that in any society, men would naturally group themselves into interests, the debtor versus the creditor, the merchant versus the farmer, and that these groups would move in a predatory cycle to seize control of the law. To Madison, the greatest danger to liberty was not a king, but the unbridled will of the neighbors. Madison's private correspondence reflects an anxiety about the immediacy of passion. He feared that the American people, in their pursuit of sudden relief or leveling, would ignore the long-term stability of the law. He watched the unrest of Shays' Rebellion and the paper money riots with a cold, intellectual terror. He envisioned a future where the pulse of the mob would dictate the decisions of the legislature, leading to a volatile, changing code of laws that no citizen could rely upon. This was the peril of the temporary, a dread that the experiment would be ruined by a single, heated afternoon of voting. He sought to build filters, the Senate, the Electoral College, the judiciary, to slow down the public mind, fearing that if the government moved too fast, it would inevitably crash. The personal toll of this fear was a life of exhausting detail. Madison felt the crushing weight of every clause and comma in the Constitution, believing that a single structural flaw would allow the tyranny of the majority to seep in like water through a cracked foundation. His private notes reveal a man who was obsessed with checks and balances, not as abstract concepts, but as mechanical brakes on the human ego. He lived in a state of intellectual alert, constantly scanning the horizon for the rise of the populist. He feared that the very openness of the American system would be its undoing, that it would be too easy for a majority to become a faction of one mind, destroying the diversity of opinion that he believed was the only true safeguard of freedom, beyond the structure of the laws. Madison harbored an anxiety about the vastness of the territory. He worried that a republic spanning a continent would be too large to maintain a connection between the people and their representatives. In his private papers, he expressed a concern that the central government would eventually become an abstraction, distant and misunderstood by the people in the far-flung edges of the frontier. He feared that this distance would lead to a resentment, creating a cycle of localist rebellion that would eventually fracture the Union into a dozen warring petty states. This was a geographic peril, the fear that the black spirit of 1776 could not survive the dilution of space. The contrast between the quiet father of the Constitution and the haunted architect of the private page is profound. Madison used his methodical nature as a defense against the chaos of the crowd. He knew that ambition must be made to counteract ambition, a philosophy that he applied to every part of his work. His fear was that enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, a realization that the system had to be strong enough to survive the follies of the men who would inevitably lead it. The image of Madison finally leaning back from his drafts, the precision of his work complete, offers a sense of profound structural security. The tyranny of the majority he feared has been ally-tempered by the very brakes he designed. The passions of the moment have often been slowed by the process of the law, allowing the Republican spirit to prevail over the mob. The vastness of the territory has been bridged by a centrational identity that Madison helped to create. The study at Montpelier is quiet now, the scratching of the pen replaced by the soft night song of the Virginia hills. The mechanical brakes of the government are in place. The foundation is holding, and the will of the neighbors is balanced by the rights of the citizen. You are not responsible for the structural integrity of a nation. You are only a dweller within its historical peace. The image of Madison finally closing his law books and blowing out his lamp axe as your guide. The architecture is sound, the filters are working, and the tyranny of the day is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried rhythm of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep, peaceful stillness of the room. Consider John Jay, perhaps the most composed and understated of the inner circle, sitting in the quiet shadows of his home in Bedford, New York. As the first Chief Justice and a veteran diplomat, Jay's forgotten fear was not a domestic one, but an outward-looking dread of foreign intrigue, while Madison worried about the mob and Hamilton about the bank. Jay looked across the dark Atlantic and saw a nest of spiders, a cycle of European powers waiting to entangle the young vulnerable United States in their ancient bloody webs of influence. His secret diaries and diplomatic dispatches reveal a man who lived in a state of professional paranoia, fearing that the sovereignty of America was a fragile glass vessel in a room full of iron hammers. As you settle into the deep stillness of your room, imagine the atmosphere of Jay's study. The sound is the steady ticking of a precision clock, a reminder of the calculated, cold nature of international politics. Jay was a realist, and he harbored a deep-seated fear that the revolutionary spirit would be seduced by foreign gold. His hidden worries focused on the peril of the weak treaty. He believed that the European courts, London, Paris, Madrid, viewed the United States not as a peer, but as a pawn to be manipulated. He feared an invisible colonization, where the American economy and its political leaders were quietly bought by foreign interests, turning the Republic into a hollow shell of a nation. Jay's private correspondence reflects an anxiety about the vanity of the diplomat. He had seen firsthand the decadent atmosphere of the European courts, and he feared that American representatives would be dazzled by the titles and the luxury of the old world. He worried about an erosion of loyalty, where a minister sent to London or Paris would begin to see the world through the eyes of the foreign crown rather than his own people. This was the peril of the whisper, the fear that the real decisions affecting American farmers and merchants were being made in the candlelit shadows of a European palace, far from the reach of American law. To Jay, neutrality was not just a policy. It was a daily struggle for survival in a world of wolves. The personal toll of this fear was a life of guarded silence. Jay felt the crushing weight of every word he wrote in a treaty or a legal opinion, fearing that a single ambiguous phrase would provide an opening for a foreign power to seize American territory or dictate American trade. His private notes reveal a man who was obsessed with national character, believing that a nation that could not keep its word or protect its borders was destined for the dustbin of history. He lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, scanning the arrival of ships for news of a new alliance or a secret pact. He feared that the American experiment would be traded away by a corrupt few before the many even realized the danger. Beyond the treaties, Jay harbored an anxiety about internal discord as an invitation to foreign meddling. In his private papers, he expressed a concern that the regional jealousies between the North and South were signals to European spies. He feared that a foreign king would sponsor a faction in one state to undermine the federal government in another, creating a cycle of civil strife fueled by foreign silver. This was a sophisticated geopolitical peril, the fear that the United States would become the divided states, a collection of protectorates overseen by the very monarchs the revolution had sought to overthrow. He envisioned a future where the spirit of independence was drowned out by the demands of the creditor nations. The contrast between the steady, judicial Jay and the anxious sentinel of the private page is striking. Jay used his unflappable, cool demeanor as a defense against the deceit of the world. He knew that nations have no permanent friends, only permanent interests, a philosophy that he applied to every negotiation. His fear was that the American people were too trusting, unaware that the polite language of diplomacy was often a mask for the dagger. The image of Jay finally closing his diplomatic pouches, the seals of wax cooling in the night air, offers a sense of profound, protective security. The foreign intrigue he feared was ally countered by the very treaties of neutrality and the national credit he helped to establish. The wolves of the old world were held at bay by a growing American strength that eventually made the spider's web impossible to cast. The sovereignty of America proved to be not a glass vessel, but an enduring vessel of iron. The house in Bedford is quiet now, the ticking of the clock, a soothing, steady heartbeat in the dark. The nest of spiders has long since vanished into the archives of the 19th century, leaving behind a legacy of independence and a clear-eyed understanding of the world. You are not responsible for the defense of a nation's borders or the secrets of its treaties. You are only a citizen of its peaceful legacy. The image of Jay finally leaning back in his chair, the parchment of state safely locked away, serves as your guide. The borders are secure, the alliances are balanced, and the intrigue of the world is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried rhythm of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep, peaceful stillness of the room. The collective psyche of the Founding Fathers was haunted by a singular ghost from English history, Oliver Cromwell. This was the peril of the Cromwell moment, the deep-seated dread that their fragile republic, born of revolution, would inevitably collapse into a military dictatorship. They looked back at the 17th century and saw a pattern. A people rise against a king, the country falls into chaos, and a strong man emerges from the army to restore order at the cost of liberty. This fear was not an abstract historical lesson. It was a daily anxiety that influenced every decision regarding the standing army, the powers of the commander-in-chief, and the very structure of the executive branch. As you sink into the quiet safety of your bed, imagine the tension of the early 1780s, just after the fighting had stopped, but before the peace was truly won. The sound of the era was the grumbling of unpaid soldiers in their winter huts. The Founding Fathers sat in their various offices, listening to these whispers with a profound internal chill. They feared that a Newburgh conspiracy, a movement of officers frustrated by a weak Congress, would lead to a military coup. Their hidden worries focused on the peril of the popular general. They knew that a man who could lead men into battle could just as easily lead them into the halls of government. To the founders, the transition from liberator to dictator was a almost mechanical inevitability of human nature. The private correspondence of men like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson reflects an obsession with the standing army as a nursery of tyranny. They feared that a permanent military force would create a separate caste of citizens whose interests were at odds with the civilian population. They envisioned a future where the clank of the sword drowned out the steady deliberations of the legislature. This was the peril of the barracks, the fear that once a nation became comfortable with the presence of soldiers in its streets, it had already begun the march back toward monarchy. They preferred the inconsistency of a citizen militia, believing that a man who returned to his plow at the end of a war was the only true guardian of a republic. The personal toll of this fear was an almost frantic desire to check the power of the president. In the constitutional debates, every proposal for a unitary executive was met with the shadow of Cromwell. The founders were terrified that the president would use the commander-in-chief title to become a Cromwell in a powdered wig. Their private notes reveal a man like George Washington who felt the crushing weight of this suspicion. He knew that his every gesture, the way he dressed, the way he rode his horse, his decision to resign his commission was being scrutinized for signs of Caesarism. He had to perform a public ritual of relinquishing power to prove that he was not the ghost the others feared. Beyond the threat of a single man, the founders harbored an anxiety about the pretext of emergency. They feared that a future leader would manufacture a cycle of crises, wars, rebellions, or civil unrest to justify the expansion of military power. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that liberty is rarely lost all at once, but is eroded in the name of security. They envisioned a future where the Cromwell moment arrived, not through a violent coup, but through a legalistic transition, where the people willingly traded their rights for the quietude of the sword. This was a psychological peril, the fear that the human desire for order was a recurring trap that every republic would eventually fall into. The contrast between the victorious revolutionaries and the anxious legislators is a testament to their foresight. They used their structural checks as a defense against the hero. They ensured that the purse and the sword were separated, with Congress holding the money and the president leading the troops. Their fear was that if men were angels, no government would be necessary, a philosophy that assumed the worst of human ambition to protect the best of human potential. The image of Washington at Annapolis, his hand trembling as he surrendered his commission to a weak and cash-strapped Congress, offers a sense of profound relief. The Cromwell moment was averted because the great man of the age chose to be a great citizen instead. The standing army was balanced by a deep cultural commitment to civilian control. The ghost of Cromwell was laid to rest not by force, but by a collective agreement to trust in the process of the law over the shining promise of the sword. The halls of government are quiet now, the debates of the past stilled by the night. The pretext of emergency has been met time and again by an enduring commitment to the Constitution. You are not responsible for the balance of power or the movements of the military. You are only a beneficiary of its historical restraint. The image of the sword being returned to its scabbard and the general returning to his farm acts as your guide. The republic is civilian, the laws are supreme, and the strong man is still by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried rhythm of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep, peaceful stillness of the room. The founding fathers lived in a state of financial vertigo, haunted by the ghost of the empty treasury. This was not merely a concern over balancing a budget. It was an existential dread that the United States would dissolve because its currency was perceived as a fiction. To the men who had watched the continental dollar collapse until it was literally used as wallpaper or kindling, the peril of worthless paper was a reminder of how quickly a revolution could turn into a farce. They harbored a deep-seated fear that a nation without a bottom to its chest was a nation without a soul, vulnerable to the mockery of foreign creditors and the violent resentment of its own citizens. As you settle into the soft quiet of your evening, imagine the atmosphere of a government office in the mid-1780s. The sound was the hollow echo of a vault that contained nothing but promises to pay. The founding fathers sat at their desks, surrounded by piles of certificates of indebtedness, worthless slips of paper given to soldiers and farmers in exchange for their service and their crops. Their hidden worries focused on the peril of the broken contract. They knew that a government that could not pay its debts was a government that had already lost its moral authority. To the founders, the ghost of the empty treasury was a herald of anarchy, a signal that the social contract was being shredded by the lack of hard coin. The private correspondence of men like Alexander Hamilton and Robert Morris reflects an obsession with public credit. They feared that the American people would lose their trust in the very idea of a national government if they were perpetually paid in shuffled paper. They envisioned a future where the United States was a pariah nation, ally barred from the world's markets because its word was worth nothing. This was the peril of the beggar, the fear that the sovereignty they had fought for was an illusion if they had to go hat in hand to the cold-hearted bankers of Amsterdam or London just to keep the lights on. They understood that credit was a psychological construct, and they feared that once it was broken, it could never be ally mended. The personal toll of this fear was a life of administrative desperation. Men who had been wealthy planters or successful lawyers found themselves in the humiliating position of borrowing from one to pay another. Their private notes reveal an anxiety that they were building a house on soap bubbles. They looked at the paper money riots in Rhode Island and the desperation of Shays' rebellion and saw a glimpse of the future, a cycle of inflation and insurrection that would make the rule of King George look like a golden age of stability. They were terrified that the spirit of 1776 would be traded for a loaf of bread and a stable currency under a new, homegrown tyrant. Beyond the domestic debt, the founders harbored an anxiety about the debt of honor to France. They feared that if they did not pay back the millions borrowed during the war, the French king would eventually send a fleet to collect it in territory rather than gold. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that independence is a shadow if the title to the land is held by a foreign creditor. They envisioned a future where the American West was ally mortgaged to European powers, turning the vast frontier into a creditor's colony. This was a geopolitical peril, the fear that the empty treasury was an invitation to the old world to return and finish what it had started. The contrast between the grand designs of the Constitution and the pathetic reality of the ledger is a testament to their perseverance. They used their technical systems of tariffs, excises, and a national bank as a defense against the ghost. They understood that a national debt could be a national blessing if it was handled with mathematical precision, turning the creditors of the nation into its most supporters. Their fear was that money is the sinew of war and the oil of peace, a philosophy that placed the ledger at the very heart of the law. The image of a new American coin, the silver dollar, finally rolling across a wooden table, offers a sense of profound, heavy security. The ghost of the empty treasury was banished by the report on public credit and the steady collection of revenue. The worthless paper was replaced by a national currency that eventually became the bedrock of the global economy. The promises to pay were honored, turning the soap bubbles into a foundation of solid granite. The financial world is quiet now, the panics of the 18th century stilled by the night. The national credit is no longer a fragile experiment, but an enduring reality. You are not responsible for the stability of the treasury or the movements of the market. You are only a dweller within its historical security. The image of the empty vault, finally filled with the gold of a nation's word, acts as your guide. The debts are funded, the currency is sound, and the ghost is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried rhythm of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep, peaceful stillness of the room. The founding fathers often looked toward the sunset with a mixture of awe and absolute, cold-blooded dread. This was the peril of the frontier, the collective fear that the vast, unmapped wilderness stretching toward the Pacific would not be the empire of liberty Jefferson imagined, but rather an abyss that would swallow the young republic whole. To the men gathered in the coastal cities of Philadelphia and New York, the frontier was a place of centrifugal force, an energy that threatened to pull the states apart, drawing the citizenry into a lawless vacuum where the authority of the Constitution could not reach. They harbored a deep-seated fear that the West would become a breeding ground for separate, warring confederacies, or worse, a playground for European empires to carve up the American soul. As you settle into the sheltering warmth of your bed, imagine the maps that sat upon the desks of the early government. They were tapestries of unknowns, with jagged mountain ranges and river systems that faded into blank, cream-colored parchment. The sound of the era was the distant crackle of a campfire and the steady, heavy thud of an axe against ancient timber. The founding fathers sat in their candlelit offices, staring at these gaps in the map with a profound internal anxiety. They feared that the pioneers, the restless movers of the age, would eventually lose their connection to the laws of the East, their hidden worries focused on the peril of the renegade. They knew that a man 1,000 miles from a courtroom was a man who might decide to start his own kingdom. The private correspondence of men like George Washington and James Madison reflects an obsession with Western secession. They feared that the settlers beyond the Alleghenies, frustrated by the difficulty of transporting their crops to the Atlantic coast, would trade their American citizenship for Spanish gold or British protection in exchange for access to the Mississippi River. They envisioned a future where the United States was a coastal strip ally hemmed in by a hostile European-backed Western empire. This was the peril of the river, the fear that geography was a force stronger than ideology, and that the waters flowing toward the Gulf of Mexico would carry the people's loyalty away from the heart of the Union. The personal toll of this fear was an administrative obsession with internal improvements. Washington, in particular, spent his final years ally fixated on the creation of canals and roads that would bind the West to the East. His private notes reveal a man who felt he was racing against the wilderness. He looked at the movement of the wagons and saw a potential exodus. He feared that the American character would be devolved by the isolation of the frontier, turning civilized citizens into barbarians who valued the rifle over the ballot box. They were terrified that the spirit of 1776 could not survive the loneliness of the woods, and that the Republic would fracture into a dozen petty chiefdoms ruled by the strongest hand. Beyond the domestic threat, the founders harbored an anxiety about the indigenous shadow. They feared that the native tribes, pushed and squeezed by the advancing settlers, would form a great Western alliance backed by the British in Canada. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that the frontier is a wound that will never heal, a cycle of violence that would drain the federal treasury and keep the nation in a state of perpetual war. They envisioned a future where the unmapped wild was a fortress for their enemies, a place where the old world could eternally sabotage the new. This was a geographic peril, the fear that the continent was too large to be loved and too wild to be governed. The contrast between the vision of manifest destiny and the anxiety of the borderland is a testament to their struggle. They used their structural tools, the Northwest Ordinance and the survey of townships, as a defense against the chaos of the wild. They understood that the land had to be gridded and filed before it could be settled, turning the abyss into a series of legal units. Their fear was that the wilderness is a siren song of anarchy, a philosophy that required the chain and the compass to be the true vanguard of civilization. The image of a surveyor's transit, standing steady on a hillside in the Ohio country, offers a sense of profound, orderly security. The peril of the frontier was countered by the purchase of the Louisiana Territory and the steady expansion of the federal law. The blank spaces on the map were filled with the names of states and counties, turning the vacuum into a union. The Mississippi became not a boundary of betrayal, but an artery of American commerce, turning the geography of division into a foundation of solid unity. The woods are quiet now, the tensions of the 18th century border stilled by the night. The frontier is no longer a menace, but an enduring part of the national landscape. You are not responsible for the mapping of the wild or the movement of the settlers. You are only a citizen of its historical peace. The image of the unmapped wild, finally brought into the light of the law, acts as your guide. The maps are finished, the boundaries are set, and the abyss is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried rhythm of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep, peaceful stillness of the room. The Founding Fathers may have championed the liberty of the press in their public declarations, but in the quiet, private sanctuary of their studies, they viewed the paper war with a sense of profound dread. This was the peril of the misled public, the collective fear that the very newspapers that had helped ignite the revolution would now become the engines of its destruction. To the men who had carefully crafted the Constitution, the early American press was not a neutral observer, but a partisan weapon, a scurrilous machine capable of spreading toxins and manufactured falsehoods that could turn the citizenry against their own government. They harbored a deep-seated fear that the voice of the people was being hijacked by a few vicious editors who prioritized the clatter of the printing press over the steady, boring truth of the law. As you settle into the unhurried peace of the night, imagine the atmosphere of a printer's shop in 1790. The sound was the heavy thump-clack of the wooden press and the smell of sharp, pungent ink. The Founding Fathers sat in their offices, reading these broadsides with a sense of internal agony. They saw their characters assassinated, their motives questioned, and their private lives dragged into the public mud. Their hidden worries focused on the peril of the unfiltered lie. They knew that in a republic, the truth is a fragile thing that requires a virtuous audience, and they feared that the press was degrading the public mind, making it impossible for the people to distinguish between a statesman and a demagogue. The private correspondence of men like George Washington and John Adams reflects a constant obsession with the licentiousness of the press. Washington, who had been deified during the war, was shocked by the vitriol he faced as president. He feared that the paper war was a signal to the world that the American government was unstable and divided. He envisioned a future where no man of character would ever seek public office because the torture of the press was too great a price to pay. This was the peril of the reputation, the fear that the scratching of a malicious pen could undo 40 years of honorable service in a single afternoon. To the founders, the press was often not a watchdog, but a wolf that threatened to devour the very peace it claimed to protect. The personal toll of this fear was a life of defensive bitterness. John Adams, in particular, felt the crushing weight of the Aurora and other partisan papers, leading him to support the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts. His private notes reveal a man who felt besieged by foreign-born editors whom he believed were agents of French or British intrigue. He looked at the chaos of public opinion and saw a glimpse of the end, a society where noise replaced reason, and where the loudest voice always won. They were terrified that the spirit of 1776 would be drowned out by a sea of ink, and that the people would be led like sheep by whoever controlled the most presses. Beyond the personal attacks, the founders harbored an anxiety about the speed of information. They feared that the pulse of the news, even in its 18th century form, was faster than the pace of deliberation. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that the public was reacting to headlines before they could understand the underlying complexities of a treaty or a tax. They envisioned a future where the government was reactive rather than visionary, forced to chase the whims of the editor rather than the needs of the nation. This was a cognitive peril, the fear that the printing press was an industrial force that the human capacity for wisdom could not keep up with. The contrast between the ideal of the free press and the anxiety of the slandered leader is a testament to the complexity of the era. They used their own counterattacks, anonymous essays in the Gazette of the United States or the National Gazette as a defense against their rivals. They understood that the paper war was an inescapable part of the new politics, but they never truly grew comfortable with it. Their fear was that the press is a fire that can warm the house or burn it down, a philosophy that required a constant vigilance over the fuel being fed into it. The image of a newspaper being folded and set aside on a quiet parlor table offers a sense of profound historical security. The paper war of the 1790s was survived, and the misled public eventually found its balance. The vicious editors faded into the archives, and the steady stability of the American institutions proved to be stronger than the noise of the broadsides. The truth was preserved in the records of the state, turning the sea of ink into a foundation of solid history. The printing houses are quiet now, the thump-clack of the 18th century press stilled by the night. The paper war is no longer a menace, but a studied chapter in the story of democracy. You are not responsible for the headlines of the day or the noise of the media. You are only a reader of its historical resilience. The image of the scurrilous broadside, finally yellowing and crumbling into the dust of time, acts as your guide. The debates are archived, the characters are vindicated, and the noise is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep, peaceful stillness of the room. The Founding Fathers were children of the Enlightenment, obsessed with the precision of clockwork and the orderly laws of the physical world. Yet they lived in a state of constant anxiety regarding the clockwork crisis. This was the peril of the great silence, the collective, persistent fear that the United States was simply too large for the speed of the human voice or the pace of a horse. To the men in Philadelphia, the distant edges of the Republic in Georgia or the Kentucky Territory were not just places on a map. They were voids where the authority of the federal government could vanish for weeks at a time. They harbored a deep-seated dread that the machinery of state would fall out of sync, with the pendulum of the law swinging at different speeds in different places, eventually leading to a mechanical collapse of the entire Union. As you settle into the motionless peace of the present, imagine the atmosphere of the early American postal system. The sound was the solitary clop-thud of a post-rider's horse and the creak of a leather mailbag. The Founding Fathers sat in their offices, staring at the calendar with a profound internal tension, waiting for news that was already 14 days old. Their hidden worries focused on the peril of the information lag. They knew that a crisis could erupt in a distant state, a rebellion, a foreign landing, or a sudden surge of financial panic, and they would not even know it existed until the damage was already irreparable. To the founders, distance was not just a geographic fact. It was an invisible enemy that conspired against the steady stability of the law. The private correspondence of men like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison reflects a constant obsession with the speed of the mail. They feared that the heartbeat of the government could not be felt at the extremities of the nation. They envisioned a future where the people of the frontier felt abandoned, leading them to create their own centers of power. This was the peril of the vacuum, the fear that in the silence between the sending of a letter and its arrival, the spirit of 1776 would evaporate. They understood that a republic requires a shared consensus, and they feared that the vast, silent forests of the interior were an insulator that prevented that common understanding from ever forming. The personal toll of this fear was a life of administrative frustration. Men like Benjamin Franklin, who had served as a postmaster general, understood the necessity of the road. Their private notes reveal a nagging anxiety about the fragility of the connection. They looked at the failure of a bridge or the miring of a carriage in the spring mud and saw it as a threat to the Constitution itself. They were terrified that the deliberative pace of the Senate would be made mockery of by the chaotic pace of the wilderness. They feared that the clockwork of the government would become uncoupled, with the president making decisions based on ghosts' information that was no longer true by the time it reached his desk. Beyond the logistical hurdles, the founders harbored an anxiety about mental isolation. They feared that citizens living in the silent distances would develop a provincial mindset, caring only for their local creek or their local tax rather than the destiny of the nation. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that the mind cannot travel as fast as the bird, leading to a cycle of misunderstanding between the capital and the country. They envisioned a future where the United States was a patchwork of isolated communities, each speaking the same language but living in different centuries. This was a sociological peril. The fear that the bonds of affection that held the states together would be stretched until they snapped. The contrast between the orderly grid of the Constitution and the wild pulse of the landscape is a testament to their struggle for control. They used their logistical tools, the expansion of post roads and the creation of federal gazettes, as a defense against the Great Silence. They understood that the word had to be transported as reliably as the grain, turning the void into a network. Their fear was that a government that cannot be heard is a government that does not exist, a philosophy that required the post horn to be as vital as the gavel. The image of a postrider finally emerging from the dark woods, the jingle of his harness signaling the arrival of the will of the state, offers a sense of profound relief. The clockwork crisis was managed by the steady improvement of the infrastructure and the eventual acceleration of communication. The silent distances were bridged by the persistence of the letter, turning the vacuum into a conversation. The pendulum of the law was eventually synced across the continent, turning the geography of silence into a foundation of solid communication. The roads are quiet now, the anxieties of the 18th century postrider stilled by the night. The distance that once threatened to swallow the republic is now an instant connection. You are not responsible for the speed of information or the synchronization of the government. You are only a dweller within its historical connectivity. The image of the late letter finally arriving and the order being restored acts as your guide. The mail is delivered, the network is whole, and the silence is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. The founding fathers lived in the long, dark wake of a monarchy they had spent their lives dismantling. Yet they remained haunted by the shadow of the crown. This was a collective dread that the American experiment was merely a brief intermission before an inevitable return to kingship. To men like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, the trappings of power were not just matters of etiquette, but signals of a creeping, silent counter-revolution. They harbored a deep-seated fear that secret monarchists, men who preferred the stability of a throne to the mésances of a republic, were hiding in plain sight within the government, waiting for the right moment of chaos to invite a royal protector back to American shores. As you settle into the quiet security of your own home, imagine the charged atmosphere of a dinner party in Philadelphia in the 1790s. The sound was the steady clinking of silverware and the low, guarded murmurs of political rivals. The founders watched each other with a profound internal tension. They looked for monarchical tendencies in the simplest gestures, the way a president entered a room, the titles used to address high officials, or the choice of a carriage over a horse. Their hidden worries focused on the peril of the royal habit. They knew that for centuries, the human mind had been trained to seek a single paternal figure of authority, and they feared that the American people were not yet psychologically weaned from the comfort of a crown. The private correspondence of the era reflects an obsession with high-toned government. Jefferson, in particular, viewed Alexander Hamilton as a closet monarchist, believing his financial systems were designed to create a new aristocracy of paper and influence. He feared that the spirit of 1776 was being quietly suffocated by a desire for British-style order. He envisioned a future where the president's term was extended to life, where the Senate became a hereditary house, and where the equality of the citizen was traded for the hierarchy of the subject. This was the peril of the imitation, the fear that in trying to build a stable nation, they were accidentally building a mirror image of the tyranny they had fled. The personal toll of this fear was a life of defensive vigilance. John Adams, despite his deep commitment to the Republic, was frequently accused of being a monarchist because of his fascination with the stability of the British Constitution. His private notes reveal a man who felt profoundly misunderstood, trapped between his belief in a strong executive and his loathing of actual kings. He looked at the rise of General Bonaparte in France and saw a terrifying confirmation of his fears, that republics were naturally volatile and that the people would eventually cry out for a master. The founders were terrified that the American character was too fragile to survive without a father figure, leading to a cycle of regression that would make their sacrifices meaningless. Beyond the personalities of leadership, the founders harbored an anxiety about the vanity of the city. They feared that as American cities grew more opulent, they would naturally adopt the corrupting fashions of the European courts. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that the simplicity of the farmer was being replaced by the sycophancy of the courtier. They envisioned a future where the capital city became a den of intrigue, a place where wealth and titles mattered more than virtue or the law. This was a cultural peril, the fear that the Republican soul would be traded for a silken ribbon, and that the people would become subjects in all but name. The contrast between the grand experiment in liberty and the paranoia of the secret king is a testament to the high stakes of the time. They used their structural tools, the prohibition of titles of nobility and the strict limitation of executive power, as a defense against the shadow. They understood that the language of the law had to be plain and unadorned to prevent it from being twisted into a royal decree. Their fear was that the crown is a seductive ghost, an idea that required constant public rejection to keep it from taking root in the American imagination. The image of a simple wooden chair in the president's office, devoid of gold leaf or velvet, offers a sense of profound, humble security. The shadow of the crown was managed by the steady, intentional refusal of the early presidents to act like monarchs. The titles of highness were rejected in favor of the simple Mr. President, turning the throne into a desk. The ghost of the king was banished by the peaceful, regular transition of power, proving that the nation could function without a father, but with a servant of the law. The palaces of the old world are distant now. The anxieties of the 18th century Republican stilled by the night. Monarchy is no longer a menace, but a historical curiosity. You are not responsible for guarding the Republic against secret kings or aristocratic plots. You are only a citizen of its enduring egalitarian legacy. The image of the crown being replaced by the ballot axe as your guide. The hierarchy is gone, the law is equal, and the shadow is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. For the founding fathers, the Atlantic Ocean was not merely a barrier or a highway, it was a vast, unpredictable wilderness that held the peril of the sea. This was a collective anxiety that the young United States, pinned between a massive continent and an unforgiving ocean, would be strangled in its cradle by maritime powers. To the men in the coastal ports of Salem, Boston, and Charleston, the horizon was a source of constant tension. They harbored a deep-seated fear that the sovereignty of the flag was a hollow concept if American sailors could be dragged from their decks by foreign navies, or if American commerce could be devoured by the Barbary pirates of North Africa. They worried that the ocean, rather than being a buffer of safety, was an open door through which the old world could eternally reach in and seize the fruits of American labor. As you sink into the steady comfort of your surroundings, imagine the atmosphere of a merchant's counting house in 1795. The sound was the distant creaking of masts in the harbor and the snapping of wet canvas in the wind. The founding fathers sat in their offices, reading frantic reports of impressment, the forced recruitment of American sailors into the British Royal Navy. Their hidden worries focused on the peril of the disrespected vessel. They knew that a nation that could not protect its trade was a nation that could not sustain its economy. To the founders, the sea was a lawless space where the rules of the Constitution meant nothing against the weight of a 60-gun ship of a. The private correspondence of men like John Jay and Thomas Jefferson reflects a constant obsession with freedom of the seas. They feared that the United States was being treated as a second-class power, allowed to trade only where and when the great empires permitted. Jefferson, in particular, was haunted by the humiliation of tribute, the practice of paying North African states to leave American ships alone. He felt a profound internal agony at the thought of a republic buying its safety like a servant. He envisioned a future where American trade was a hostage to every pirate or privateer with a fast ship and a hungry crew. This was the peril of the tributary, the fear that the independence won on land would be quietly surrendered at sea. The personal toll of this fear was a life of grueling diplomatic and military calculation. Men like John Adams, who pushed for the creation of a permanent navy, found themselves at odds with those who feared that a fleet would lead to unnecessary wars. Their private notes reveal an anxiety about the cost of protection. They looked at the price of building the USS Constitution and the USS United States and saw a potential for national bankruptcy. They were terrified that the spirit of 1776 would be crushed by the sheer expense of defending the coastline. They feared that the ocean was a money pit that would swallow the federal treasury long before it ever produced a profit, beyond the threat of pirates and empires. The founders harbored an anxiety about isolationism versus entanglement. They feared that as long as America was a maritime nation, it would be dragged into the whirlpool of European wars. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that every merchant ship was a potential spark that could ignite a conflict at home. They envisioned a future where the United States was perpetually at the mercy of foreign blockades, leading to a cycle of embargo and starvation that would break the will of the people. This was a strategic peril, the fear that the oceanic connection was a chain that kept the Republic tethered to the very systems of power it had tried to escape. The contrast between the grand vision of global commerce and the reality of the vulnerable sloop is a testament to their persistence. They used their structural tools, the creation of the Navy Department, and the negotiation of maritime treaties as a defense against the sea void. They understood that commerce is the handmaid of agriculture, but only if the handmaid was protected by iron and oak. Their fear was that a nation without a navy is a nation without a voice, a philosophy that turned the shipyard into as vital a place of government as the capital. The image of a tall ship finally returning to port, its hold full and its colors flying unmolested, offers a sense of profound, heavy security. The peril of the sea was managed by the steady build of the old Ironsides generation and the eventual, hard-won respect of the global powers. The oceanic wilderness was brought under the rule of the law, turning the hostage trade into a global network. The impressment of sailors eventually faded into the archives, turning the vulnerable deck into a foundation of solid maritime pride. The harbors are quiet now, the anxieties of the 18th century merchant stilled by the night. The ocean is no longer a menace but a bridge to the world. You are not responsible for the protection of the coastline or the safety of the trade routes. You are only a beneficiary of its historical strength. The image of the protected fleet finally resting at Anchorage as your guide. The sails are furled, the cannons are silent, and the deep is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep, peaceful stillness of the room. The Founding Fathers, for all their eloquence regarding the natural rights of man, lived within the shadow of a profound and heavy moral crisis. This was the collective dread of the slavery contradiction, the unsettling realization that the foundation of their new republic was cleaved by a deep moral fault line. In the quiet hours of reflection, men like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and even George Washington looked at the institution of chattel slavery not just as a labor system, but as a slow-burning fuse. They harbored a secret fear that the blessings of liberty they had secured for some were being systematically undermined by the bondage of others, creating a structural instability that no amount of legislative balancing could truly fix. Jefferson famously captured this terror in his private correspondence, writing that the debates over the expansion of slavery moved him like a fire bell in the night, which awakened and filled me with terror. He realized that the very existence of the Union was at stake, calling it the knell of the Union. As you settle into the weightless calm of the evening, imagine the atmosphere of a study in Virginia. The sound was the steady ticking of a clock and the occasional rustle of parchment, yet beneath it lay an unspoken tension. The founders sat in their rooms, drafting constitutions that spoke of equality while the world outside their windows remained stubbornly unchanged. They knew that by delaying the confrontation with slavery to preserve the Union, they were merely handing a more volatile crisis to their children. To the founders, this was the ghost at the banquet, a presence that made every celebration of independence feel fragile and incomplete. Jefferson, in a moment of uncharacteristic candor, wrote that he trembled for his country when he reflected that God is just and that his justice could not sleep forever. He feared that the spirit of 1776 would eventually be turned against the masters themselves. He described the predicament of the American statesman with haunting precision. "We have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale, and self-preservation on the other." This was the peril of the harvest, the fear that they were sowing seeds of discord that would inevitably result in a terminal crop. They understood that a house divided against itself could not stand, yet they lacked the collective will to move the walls. The personal toll of this fear was a life of complicated moral evasion. Men who prided themselves on their logic and their commitment to Enlightenment ideals found themselves trapped in a web of economic necessity and social habit. Their private notes reveal an anxiety about their own legacies. They wondered if they would be remembered as liberators or as hypocrites who stopped short of the finish line. Washington, in his final years, became increasingly fixated on the duty of manumission, eventually arranging for the freedom of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon in his will. It was a singular, quiet attempt to reconcile his private conscience with his public role, a sign of the internal pressure that defined the age. Beyond the moral weight, the founders harbored a practical anxiety about political paralysis. They feared that the slavery issue would eventually become the only thing the states talked about. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that the regional jealousies between North and South would coalesce around this issue, making it impossible to pass a tax, ratify a treaty, or even maintain a common defense. They envisioned a future where the machinery of government was perpetually jammed by this single, immovable contradiction. This was a systemic peril, the fear that the compromises of 1787 were not solutions, but merely postponements of an inevitable explosion. The contrast between the light of the Enlightenment and the shadow of the field is a testament to the tragic limitations of the era. They understood that the logic of liberty was a universal force that could not be indefinitely contained, yet they feared the chaos of the transition more than the injustice of the status quo. Their fear was that justice is a slow fire, an idea that brought warmth to the oppressed, but terror to the architect who had built his house out of combustible materials. The image of the Great Silence finally being broken by the loud, discordant voices of the next generation offers a sense of somber historical gravity. The contradiction was managed for a time, but the deferred truth carried a heavy interest. The fields and the halls of power are quiet now, the anxieties of the 18th century planter and politician stilled by the night. You are not responsible for the moral failings of the past or the heavy weight of its unresolved debts. You are only a witness to its ongoing, arduous journey toward justice. The image of the unresolved paper finally being replaced by a new birth of freedom acts as your guide. The struggle is noted, the path is long, and the silence is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the founding fathers reached the twilight of their lives, a new and unsettling dread began to take hold, the peril of the successors. This was the fear that the fire of the Revolution was a singular event, fueled by a unique generation of men, and that those who followed would lack the virtue, the stamina, or the memory to keep the Republic alive. They looked at the young men entering the political arenamen, who had not felt the cold of Valley Forge or the desperate tension of the Continental Congress, and wondered if the spirit of '76 was a perishable commodity. They harbored a deep-seated worry that the blessings of liberty would be taken for granted. leading to a slow decay into apathy, factionalism, and eventual ruin. As you breathe in the cool, steady air of the present, imagine the reflective atmosphere of Monticello or Quincy in the 1820s. The sound was the soft scratching of pens as the last of the founders wrote their final letters to one another. They were orphans of a lost age, watching a new world grow up around them, a world of steam engines, expanding frontiers, and a different kind of politician. Their hidden worries focused on the peril of the inheritance. They knew that it is one thing to win a republic in the heat of battle, and quite another to maintain it in the cool shade of prosperity. To the founders, the next generation appeared dangerously comfortable, unaware that liberty is a garden that must be weeded every single day. The private correspondence between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in their final years is a poignant record of this anxiety. They moved past their old political rivalries to share a common concern. Would the Union survive the little men who were taking their places? They feared that the new leaders would prioritize local interests over the national good, turning the halls of Congress into a marketplace of narrow ambitions. They envisioned a future where the science of government was replaced by the art of the deal, and where the fundamental principles of the Constitution were bartered away for temporary popularity. This was the peril of the shallow, the fear that the deep roots of the revolution were being replaced by the thin soil of the present. The personal toll of this fear was a sense of profound historical loneliness. Men who had once commanded the attention of the world found themselves as relics, treated with a reverence that felt more like a goodbye than a consultation. Their private notes reveal a man like James Madison, who lived longer than almost all his peers, feeling the weight of being the last of the Romans. He looked at the rising sectionalism of the 1820s and feared that his life's work, the Constitution, was being pulled apart by men who saw it as a mere contract rather than a sacred bond. He was terrified that the experiment would end not with a bang, but with a whimper of neglect. Beyond the quality of leadership, the founders harbored an anxiety about the loss of revolutionary memory. They feared that as the veterans of the war died off, the stories of sacrifice would become mere fables, stripped of their emotional power. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that a people who do not remember the cost of their freedom will eventually be unwilling to pay the price to keep it. They envisioned a future where the 4th of July was a day of mere noise and parade rather than a day of solemn rededication. This was a cultural peril, the fear that the soul of the nation was tied to a specific moment in time, and that, as that time receded, the soul would wither. The contrast between the grand departure of the founders and the uncertainty of the new age is a testament to the burden of the legacy. They used their final years to write memoirs, archive letters, and found universities not out of vanity, but as a desperate attempt to school the successors. They understood that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, a philosophy they tried to pass down like a family heirloom. Their fear was that the heirloom would be sold for a pittance by an heir who did not understand its value. The image of Adams and Jefferson both passing away on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1826, offers a sense of profound symbolic closure. The peril of the successors was met by a final, dramatic reminder of the source of the nation's life. The legacy was handed over, not in a state of perfection, but as a living challenge. The fire did not go out. It merely changed hands, fueled by new arguments and new dreams that the founders could never have imagined. The old estates are quiet now, the anxieties of the last founders stilled by the night. The successors have come and gone through many generations, each facing their own version of the struggle. You are not responsible for the virtue of the future or the memory of the past. You are only a link in the ongoing chain of the American story. The image of the torch being passed acts as your guide. The work continues, the memory endures, and the ghosts of the fathers are stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. The Founding Fathers viewed the emergence of political parties not as a sign of a healthy democracy, but as a fatal disease. They viewed the spirit of party as a fire that could not be quenched, a force that would inevitably lead to a cycle of revenge, gridlock, and the eventual invitation of a foreign protector to restore order. George Washington, in his farewell address, gave a stern, almost desperate warning to the American people. He stated that parties are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people. He harbored a deep-seated fear that the Constitution, which relied on the cool and deliberate sense of the community, would be shattered by the heat of partisan passion. As you settle into the calm, unmoving darkness of the night, imagine the atmosphere of the President's house in the late 1790s. The sound was no longer the unified voice of a revolutionary cause, but the sharp, discordant echoes of a cabinet divided. The founders sat at their tables, reading newspapers that had become partisan broadsheets, each side accusing the other of treason. John Adams shared this dread, writing, "There is nothing which I dread so much as a division of the Republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader, and concerting measures in opposition to each other. This is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil under our Constitution." They knew that a republic held together by bonds of affection could not survive if those bonds were replaced by chains of resentment. The private correspondence of the era reflects a profound agony over this development. Washington looked at his own cabinet, Hamilton and Jefferson, and saw two brilliant minds locked in a struggle that threatened to tear the government apart. He envisioned a future where the science of the common good was lost in a sea of partisan noise, where every policy was judged not by its merit, but by who proposed it. This was the fear that the people would become so loyal to their faction that they would become blind to the nation. The personal toll of this fear was the destruction of lifelong friendships. Men who had stood together against the British Empire now refused to speak to one another. Their private notes reveal a sense of betrayal and mourning. Jefferson and Adams, the great pillars of the Revolution, became estranged for decades, each believing the other had become a tool of a dangerous ideology. They looked at the partisan riots in the streets and feared that the United States would follow the path of the French Revolution, where the will of the party led straight to the guillotine. They were terrified that the spirit of 1776 was being replaced by a spirit of spite, turning the Republic into a battlefield of egos beyond the halls of power. They feared that political parties would naturally align with regional interests, the North against the South, the merchant against the farmer, leading to a permanent fracture of the Union. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that a party based on local prejudice would eventually seek to leave the Union rather than lose an election. They envisioned a future where the United States was a collection of warring states rather than a single nation. This was a structural peril, the fear that the machinery of the Constitution was not strong enough to hold together a people who no longer liked or trusted one another. They used their structural tools, the checks and balances, and the separation of powers, as a defense against the tyranny of a faction. They understood that ambition must be made to counteract ambition, as Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers. But they had hoped that this struggle would take place within a shared framework of virtue. Their fear was that party is the madness of many for the gain of a few, a philosophy that saw the partisan as the greatest enemy of the citizen. The image of the first party system finally collapsing, and the eventual late-life reconciliation between Adams and Jefferson offers a sense of profound historical relief. The spirit of spite was tempered by a spirit of procedure, turning the battlefield into a ballot box. The broken friendships were mended by the passage of time, proving that the bonds of affection were stronger than the chains of resentment. The streets and the chambers of Congress are quiet now, the anxieties of the 18th century partisan stilled by the night. The political party is no longer a new disease, but an established, if difficult, part of national life. You are not responsible for the divisions of the day or the noise of the partisan struggle. You are only a dweller within the enduring, resilient structure of the Union. The image of the old rivals finally exchanging letters of peace acts as your guide. The arguments are archived, the Union remains, and the strife is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the young republic began to find its footing, the founding fathers confronted a new internal transformation, the peril of the commercial spirit. This was the collective dread that a nation born from high-minded ideals of sacrifice and agrarian virtue would be corrupted by an insatiable hunger for wealth. To men like Thomas Jefferson, the yeoman farmer was the true anchor of democracy, while the stock jobber and the speculator were agents of a new kind of decay. They harbored a deep-seated fear that the American people would trade their hard-won independence for the comforts of luxury, becoming so entangled in the pursuit of the dollar that they would lose the public spirit necessary to sustain a free government. As you settle into the quiet, unmoving safety of the night, imagine the atmosphere of a bustling counting house in New York or Philadelphia. The sound was the constant scratching of ledgers and the metallic clinking of coins being weighed. The founders watched this commercial fever with a mixture of awe and alarm. They saw land companies, banking schemes, and paper fortunes rising overnight. Their hidden worries focused on the peril of the soft citizen. They knew that history was littered with the ruins of republics that had grown wealthy, then decadent, and finally weak. To the founders, commerce was a double-edged sword. It could build a nation's strength, but it could also sharpen its private greed at the expense of its common good. The private correspondence of the era reflects a profound anxiety about national character. Jefferson, in particular, viewed the rise of a moneyed interest as a direct threat to the Constitution. He feared that a society based on buying and selling would inevitably lead to a dependency of the mind, where citizens were more concerned with their credit scores than their civil rights. He envisioned a future where the government was bought by the wealthy, and where the boring labor of the soil was abandoned for the shining gamble of the market. This was the peril of the ledger, the fear that the value of a man would be measured by his bank account rather than his virtue. The personal toll of this fear was a sense of profound alienation. For the old revolutionaries, Men who had risked their lives and fortunes for a cause found themselves in a world that seemed more interested in getting ahead than looking back. Their private notes reveal an anxiety about the erosion of simplicity. They looked at the extravagant fashions and the luxurious homes of the new merchant class and saw the seeds of a new aristocracy. They were terrified that the spirit of 1776 was being suffocated by a spirit of accumulation, turning the citizen into a consumer before the word even existed. They feared that a people who loved their stuff more than their statutes would eventually welcome any tyrant who promised to keep the markets stable. Beyond the moral concerns, the founders harbored an anxiety about financial dependency. They feared that a commercial nation would be perpetually at the mercy of fluctuations in trade and foreign depressions. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that the speculator was a man without a country, whose loyalty shifted with the wind of profit. They envisioned a future where the United States was a debtor nation, ally beholden to the very European bankers they had sought to escape. This was a strategic peril, the fear that economic chains were just as heavy as iron ones, and that the Republic's independence was a fiction if its daily bread depended on a foreign exchange. The contrast between the ideal of the Spartan Republic and the reality of the capitalist engine is a testament to the nation's growing pains. They used their structural tools, taxation, the regulation of commerce, and debates over the national bank as a way to harness the commercial spirit without letting it run wild. They understood that wealth is power, and they sought to distribute that power widely enough to prevent it from pooling in the hands of a corrupt few. Their fear was that money is a liquid that can wash away the foundations of the law, a philosophy that required a constant vigilance over the flow of interest. The image of a solid silver dollar being exchanged for an honest day's labor offers a sense of profound, grounded security. The peril of the commercial spirit was managed by the eventual understanding that commerce and agriculture could coexist, creating a diverse economy that was stronger than either could be alone. The speculator was balanced by the producer, and the moneyed interest was checked by the sovereignty of the voter. The luxuries of the world did not destroy the virtue of the people, but became the rewards of a working democracy. The markets and the counting houses are quiet now. The anxieties of the 18th century philosopher stilled by the night. The commercial spirit is no longer a new threat, but the lifeblood of the global stage. You are not responsible for the movements of the economy or the private greed of the world. You are only a dweller within the enduring historical prosperity of the Union. The image of the ledgers being closed and the honest trade being finished acts as your guide. The accounts are settled, the wealth is secure, and the fever is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. The founding fathers harbored a profound collective anxiety toward a figure they called the demagogue, the silver-tongued orator, who would use the passions of the people to dismantle the protections of the law. This was the peril of the false mirror, the fear that a charismatic leader would rise by reflecting the public's grievances back at them, promising simple solutions to complex problems while secretly building a path to absolute power. To men like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, the greatest threat to a republic was not an invading army, but an internal pretender to the people's favor who would use the very tools of democracy to murder it. As you settle into the steady, unmoving silence of your room, imagine the atmosphere of a crowded town square in the late 18th century. The sound was the thunderous applause of a mob and the high, piercing ring of a voice that promised everything to everyone. The founders watched these displays with an internal chill. They studied the histories of Greece and Rome, noting how every fallen republic began its slide into tyranny when a hero of the streets convinced the citizens that the boring checks and balances of the Constitution were merely obstacles to their happiness. Their hidden worries focused on the peril of the short memory. They knew that in moments of economic distress or social fear, the people are prone to trade their long-term liberty for the short-term comfort of a strong man. The private correspondence of the era reflects a constant obsession with the vulnerability of the public mind. Hamilton, in particular, was haunted by the idea of an American Caesar. He feared that the openness of the new system would act as an invitation to a man of unprincipled ambition. He envisioned a future where a leader would bypass the deliberative bodies of government, the Senate, the courts, the cabinet, and speak directly to the passions of the multitude. This was the peril of the stage, the fear that the theater of politics would become more powerful than the substance of the law. To the founders, the demagogue was a political wolf who dressed in the lamb's wool of the patriot. The personal toll of this fear was a life of administrative caution. The founders designed the Electoral College, the indirect election of senators, and the lifetime appointments of judges as a series of mechanical filters to slow down the momentum of a popular idol. Their private notes reveal an anxiety that even these filters would not be enough. They looked at the rise of the Jacobin clubs in France and saw a terrifying glimpse of a world where the shouting of the mob dictated the ruling of the judge. They were terrified that the spirit of 1776 was too delicate to survive a popular storm, and that the people would eventually welcome a master if he was talented enough to make them feel like conquerors rather than citizens. Beyond the threat of a single individual, the founders harbored an anxiety about the corruption of language. They feared that the demagogue would hollow out the meaning of words like liberty, justice, and the people, using them as slogans to justify the suppression of dissent. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that the public ear would become deaf to the quiet voice of reason. They envisioned a future where political debate was no longer a search for the common good, but a contest of noise, where the most extreme voices were the only ones heard. This was a cognitive peril. The fear that the rationality required for a republic to function was a rare and fleeting resource that could be easily exhausted by a single, talented liar. The contrast between the grand architect of the law and the frightened witness to the mob is a testament to the high stakes of their work. They used their structural tools, the separation of powers, and the freedom of the press, as a defense against the Pyrrho. They understood that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But since men are prone to hero worship, the government had to be a fortress of rules that no single person could ever fully occupy. Their fear was that the people are their own worst enemies when they follow a star instead of a compass, a philosophy that required a constant vigilance over the celebrity of power. The image of a president standing alone in a quiet, candlelit room, bound by the boring constraints of a written document, offers a sense of profound, protective security. The peril of the demagogue was managed by the steady, unyielding strength of the institutions and the eventual, hard-won wisdom of a public that learned to trust the process over the personality. The silver-tongued orator was balanced by the sovereign voter, and the hero was replaced by the servant of the law. The shouting of the square eventually faded into the archives of the state, turning the storm into a foundation of solid procedural stability. The squares and the podiums are quiet now, the anxieties of the 18th century legislator stilled by the night. The demagogue is a recurring ghost, but the fortress of rules remains standing. You are not responsible for the noise of the political stage or the passions of the moment. You are only a dweller within the enduring historical safety of the law. The image of the voice of the mob being stilled by the gavel of the judge acts as your guide. The rules are in place, the filters are working, and the idol is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. While the Founding Fathers spent years obsessing over the precise wording of the Constitution, they harbored a private, haunting anxiety known as the peril of the unwritten rule. This was the realization that no matter how perfect the parchment, the entire American experiment relied upon the invisible virtue of the men who inhabited the offices. They feared that a written document was merely a parchment barrier that could be easily stepped over if the leaders of the future lacked the self-restraint to honor the spirit of the law over their own ambitions. To men like James Madison, the greatest danger was a generation of politicians who would follow the letter of the law while systematically gutting its meaning. As you settle into the steady, unmoving silence of the night, imagine the atmosphere of a legal chamber in the early 1800s. The sound was the soft rustle of heavy law, books, and the low, careful tones of men debating precedent. The founders watched this process with an internal tension. They knew that their new system lacked the centuries of tradition that held the British monarchy together. Their hidden worries focused on the peril of the bad faith actor. They knew that a president or a judge with enough cunning could find a legal way to do something fundamentally illegal. To the founders, the Constitution was not a machine that would run by itself. It was a living agreement that required a constant, boring commitment to honesty and public service. The private correspondence of the era reflects a constant obsession with civic virtue. Washington, in particular, was acutely aware that his every action, his decision to step down after 2 terms, his refusal to interfere with the courts, was creating an unwritten rule that was as important as any clause in the Constitution. He feared that a future leader would look at his example and see it not as a sacred obligation, but as a voluntary choice that could be ignored. He envisioned a future where the norms of the Republic were treated as mere suggestions, leading to a world where power was restrained only by what a leader could get away with. This was the peril of the loophole, the fear that the law would become a weapon for the clever rather than a shield for the citizen. The personal toll of this fear was a life of rigid, almost exhausting self-discipline. The founders felt the crushing weight of being the first, knowing that any slip in their personal conduct would provide a justification for future corruption. Their private notes reveal a man like Alexander Hamilton, who, despite his personal flaws, was obsessed with the sanctity of the public trust. He feared that if the people once saw their leaders as self-serving, the unwritten bond of trust would be shattered forever. They were terrified that the spirit of 1776 would be replaced by a spirit of technicality, where leaders spent their time searching for ways to bypass the will of the people through the shadows of the law beyond the behavior of leaders. The founders harbored an anxiety about the virtue of the electorate. They feared that if the citizens themselves lost their unwritten commitment to the truth, the entire structure would collapse. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that a public that valued victory over justice would eventually elect leaders who mirrored their own lack of restraint. They envisioned a future where the unwritten rules of civil discourse were abandoned, turning the republic into a cold war of factions where the only goal was the total destruction of the opponent. This was a cultural peril, the fear that the habits of the heart were more fragile than the ink on the page. The contrast between the solid authority of the document and the fragile nature of the norm is a testament to the sophistication of their worry. They used their structural tools, impeachment, the veto, and the power of the purse's hard defenses. But they knew these were only effective if the people using them were men of character. They understood that constitutional morality was a learned behavior, not an instinct. Their fear was that the law is a dead letter without the breath of a virtuous people, a philosophy that placed the burden of the republic's survival squarely on the shoulders of the individual. The image of a president voluntarily leaving the capital, returning to his private life without a crown or a scepter, offers a sense of profound moral security. The peril of the unwritten rule was managed by the steady, intentional creation of precedents that became the unshakable pillars of American life. The parchment barrier was reinforced by a culture of restraint, turning the voluntary choice into a national expectation. The norms of the Republic proved to be as strong as the statutes, turning the spirit of the law into a foundation of solid historical behavior. The chambers and the offices are quiet now, the anxieties of the 18th century architect stilled by the night. The unwritten rules have been tested and tempered by 2 centuries of history. You are not responsible for the character of the leaders or the virtue of the public. You are only a dweller within the enduring, resilient traditions of the Union. The image of the peaceful transition and the honored tradition acts as your guide. The rules are followed, the spirit is kept, and the corruption is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the Founding Fathers entered the final decades of their lives, they were confronted with a deeply personal and quiet anxiety, the peril of the aged mind. This was the fear that as they grew old, the world they had painstakingly constructed would accelerate past them, leaving them as dusty relics in a society they no longer recognized. To men like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and James Madison, aging was not just a physical decline, but a strategic threat to the legacy of the Revolution. They harbored a dread that their boring adherence to Enlightenment reason was being replaced by a new, impulsive American energy that valued speed over depth and emotion over law. As you settle into the steady, unmoving silence of your surroundings, imagine the atmosphere of a library in the 1820s. The sound was the soft, persistent rasp of a quill and the ticking of a heavy grandfather clock, measuring out the remaining hours of a generation. The founders sat in their high-backed chairs, watching through their windows as a new America took shape, one of canals, steam engines, and a rugged, frontier democracy that seemed indifferent to the classical virtues of the past. Their hidden worries focused on the peril of the disconnect. They knew that a republic is only as strong as the continuity of its ideas, and they feared that the thread of wisdom was being snapped by the sheer force of progress. The private correspondence of the era reflects a poignant obsession with historical loneliness. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, in their late life letters, often wrote as if they were the last 2 survivors of a sunken continent. They feared that the spirit of '76 was being simplified into a collection of slogans, stripped of the agonizing intellectual labor that had given it life. They envisioned a future where the people would look at the Constitution as a dead document from an alien time, rather than a living shield against tyranny. This was the peril of the archive, the fear that their life's work was being moved from the mind of the citizen to the shelf of the museum. The personal toll of this fear was a sense of profound internal alienation. Men who had once been the architects of the future felt like strangers in their own country. Their private notes reveal an anxiety about the fading of the light. They looked at the rising generation of politicians, men like Andrew Jackson, and saw a wildness that terrified them. They were worried that the sober deliberation they had championed was being drowned out by the shouting of the tavern. They feared that the American mind was becoming shallow, losing the capacity for the long, careful thought required to maintain a complex government. To the aged founders, the experiment was at its most vulnerable when it was being managed by those who had never known the weight of the crown beyond the intellectual gap. The founders harbored an anxiety about physical fragility. They feared that their own deaths would signal a collapse of authority. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that the precedents they had set were only as strong as their own presence. They envisioned a future where, once the great generation was gone, the states would fall into a cycle of bickering and secession. This was a biological peril, the fear that the wisdom of the state was tied to the heartbeat of the man, and that when the heart stopped, the wisdom would evaporate. They spent their final years in a race against time, feverishly organizing their papers and founding universities to anchor their ideas in the minds of the young. The contrast between the vibrant youth of the Republic and the fading vision of the father is a testament to the bittersweet nature of their success. They used their final years to act as elder statesmen, offering warnings that were often ignored by a nation eager to move on. They understood that every generation is a new nation, but they hoped that the new nation would at least keep the old compass. Their fear was that the past is a foreign country to those who are busy building the future, a philosophy that made their final breaths feel like a message in a bottle cast into a turbulent sea. The image of the last of the founders finally laying down his pen, satisfied that he had said all he could say, offers a sense of profound historical peace. The peril of the aged mind was managed by the eventual realization that the Republic was stronger than any single man or generation. The New World did not abandon the old ideas, but incorporated them into a larger, more complex story. The thread of wisdom was not snapped. It was woven into a tapestry that spanned centuries, turning the relics of the past into the foundations of the future. The old libraries and the quiet studies are still now. The anxieties of the 18th century philosopher stilled by the night. The age that once threatened to isolate the founders has become the very history that inspires us. You are not responsible for the gap between generations or the speed of the world. You are only a recipient of the enduring cross-generational strength of the law. The image of the old book being read by a young student acts as your guide. The ideas are safe, the continuity remains, and the fading is stilled by the night. You are secure in the steady, unhurried peace of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the deep stillness of the room. As the final members of the revolutionary generation looked toward the distant future, they confronted the peril of the horizon. This was not a fear of a specific enemy or a particular law, but a quiet, existential anxiety about the ultimate fate of their creation. They harbored a deep-seated worry that the United States was a spectacular exception to the laws of history, a bright flare of liberty that would, eventually, inevitably, burn out. Two men like James Madison, who outlived nearly all his peers. The horizon was a place of both immense promise and terrifying uncertainty. He looked at the vastness of the continent and the growing complexity of the people, and wondered if any human structure, no matter how brilliantly designed, could truly withstand the relentless erosion of time. As you settle into the profound, absolute stillness of the night, imagine the atmosphere of a quiet veranda in the late 1830s. The sound was the low hum of insects in the trees and the soft sigh of the wind across the fields. The last of the founders sat in the shadows, staring at the line where the earth meets the sky. Their hidden worries focused on the peril of the infinite. They knew that they had built a house for 13 states, and they watched as it expanded to 24, then more, stretching the boring cords of the Constitution across distances they could barely fathom. To the founders, the horizon was a reminder that the Republic was always in motion, and that a body in motion is always subject to the friction of reality. The private correspondence of their final days reflects a solemn obsession with permanence. They feared that the American people would eventually tire of the burden of self-government. They envisioned a future where the citizens, weary of the constant vigilance required to keep a republic, would trade their active liberty for the passive security of a bureaucratic state. This was the peril of the sunset, the fear that the day of the revolution was over and that a night of indifference was approaching. They understood that the Constitution was merely a map, and they feared that the travelers of the future would lose the ability to read it, or worse, decide they no longer needed a map at all. The personal toll of this fear was a life of hopeful pessimism. They were men who had seen the impossible become reality, yet they remained deeply skeptical of human nature. Their private notes reveal an anxiety about the fragility of the bond. They looked at the growing tension between the North and the South, and saw a dark cloud on the horizon that they knew they would not live to see break. They were terrified that the American experiment would be recorded by history as a noble failure, a brief moment when men tried to be angels and found they were only men. They spent their final hours in a state of intellectual prayer, hoping that the foundations they had laid were deep enough to survive the storms they could see gathering in the distance. Beyond the political survival of the nation, the founders harbored an anxiety about global significance. They feared that if the United States failed, the cause of liberty would be lost to the world for 1,000 years. In their private papers, they expressed a concern that they were the last best hope of Earth, and that their collapse would prove the monarch's right, that man is incapable of governing himself. They envisioned a future where the light from the west went dark, leaving the rest of humanity in a shadow of permanent despotism. This was a planetary peril, the fear that the horizon of America was the horizon of freedom itself. The contrast between the grand vision of the future and the quiet dread of the grave is the final testament to their humanity. They used their last words to remind the nation that the work was never truly finished. They understood that liberty is a journey, not a destination, a philosophy that required every new generation to refound the Republic in their own hearts. Their fear was that the passengers of the future would fall asleep at the wheel, unaware that the road is narrow and the cliffs are steep. The image of the sun finally setting behind the hills, casting a long golden glow over the landscape, offers a sense of profound historical completion. The peril of the horizon was managed by the incredible, resilient survival of the Union through every crisis the founders feared. The spectacular exception became the enduring standard, and the map of the Constitution proved to be more accurate than even its makers dared to hope. The light from the west did not go out. It grew brighter, turning the uncertainty of the horizon into a foundation of solid global hope. The world is quiet now, the anxieties of the 18th century visionaries stilled by the night. The future they feared is the present you inhabit, and the republic they built still stands. You are not responsible for the ultimate fate of history or the infinite challenges of the horizon. You are only a keeper of the steady, unhurried peace that their sacrifices secured. The image of the new day finally breaking over the hills acts as your guide. The experiment continues. The foundation is firm, and the shadows are stilled by the night. You are secure in the deep, peaceful stillness of your own rest, where the only thing that matters is the quiet, enduring breath of the room.